Hey everybody, this is a piece by Richard B. Day. It's titled Trotsky and Preobrazhensky, The Troubled Unity of the Left Opposition. So here we go. In a recent issue of Problems of Communism, Jerry Hugh commented that the 1920s and the period of the first 5-year plan in the Soviet Union have, quote, caught the attention of a generation of scholars and provided the basis for exciting reanalysis and debate, end quote. One of the many subjects now due for more precise analysis is the character of the relationship between Leon Trotsky and Evgeny Preobrazhensky, the two most prominent spokesmen of the left opposition. For some time, historians have been vaguely aware of a latent tension in this relationship. Isaac Deutscher attributed Trotsky's misgivings to a fear that Preobrazhensky's economic writings, quote, created an opening for an intellectual reconciliation with, quote, socialism in a single country, end quote, end quote. Footnote. Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Unarmed, page 238. In my own book on Trotsky, I pointed out in 1973 that although the two leaders agreed on a wide range of policy questions, Trotsky and Preobrazhensky started from divergent theoretical premises, and Trotsky and Preobrazhensky's relationship was therefore characterized by, quote, concealed differences, end quote. Footnote, see Richard B. Day, Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation, end footnote. A much less well-guarded statement of the problem than either Deutscher's or my own is contained in Joel Carmichael's new biography of Trotsky, where it is said that Preobrazhensky believed that socialism could be built with Russian resources alone, and that this belief ultimately, quote, reconciled Preobrazhensky to, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, end quote. Footnote, Joel Carmichael, Trotsky, An Appreciation of His Life, end footnote. It is difficult to appraise the Trotsky-Preobrazhensky relationship because the apparently contradictory character of Preobrazhensky's position invites simplification. As one of the principal theorists of the opposition, Preobrazhensky on numerous occasions publicly denounced Stalin's slogan of socialism in one country. Yet, in 1928, the same man broke with Trotsky and the opposition on the grounds that Stalin's, quote, left course complied with all the previous demands of the party's left wing. Did Preobrazhensky not see that the, quote, left course was part of an endeavor to build socialism in one country? Or had he now repudiated his earlier beliefs? If so, what could have been Preobrazhensky's reasons? And why did Preobrazhensky fail to convince Trotsky? The fact that Preobrazhensky was normally a consistent thinker prompted Deutscher to suggest that the, quote, opening for an intellectual reconciliation with Stalinism lay in the theory of, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote. And the theory of, quote, primitive socialist accumulations stress upon domestic capital accumulation for industrial investments. There is no doubt that in expressing this view, Deutscher grasped a part of the explanation, but then Trotsky also referred to the need for, quote, primitive socialist accumulation. And Deutscher did not give a convincing account of the sense in which Preobrazhensky and Trotsky used primitive socialist accumulation differently, the term primitive socialist accumulation differently. Also unanswered is the question of how Preobrazhensky could consistently denounce socialism in one country in 1927 and become intellectually reconciled with Stalinism in 1928. Trotsky's archives reveal that Trotsky was apprehensive of Preobrazhensky's work by 1926 to 1927, but there is no evidence of any consciously articulated disagreement. What appears to have happened is that Trotsky by this time had become aware of the potential for disagreement in Preobrazhensky's ambiguity. In particular, Trotsky was concerned over the question of Soviet Russia's relationship to the international economy. By the mid-1920s, Trotsky was committed to a pattern of industrialization that leaned heavily upon capital imports and expanding trade relations. Preobrazhensky saw the advantages of some of Trotsky's proposals and on that basis was able for a time to maintain the unity of the opposition. But Preobrazhensky did not share Trotsky's intellectual commitment to international trade and the world division of labor. Preobrazhensky's commitment was to industrialization as such. Thus, when Preobrazhensky rejoined the party, Preobrazhensky betrayed neither Trotsky nor Preobrazhensky's own principles. Preobrazhensky and Trotsky simply disagreed. That disagreement sprang from several different sources. New section: Internationalism and the Logic of Industrialization. Preobrazhensky's belief in internationalism and the world revolution has gone largely unnoticed in Preobrazhensky's writings, although it is essential for dealing with the matter at hand. The critical text in this connection is the book titled From the NEP to Socialism, written in 1922. In From the NEP to Socialism, it was argued that capitalism had led the world economy to an impasse. The antagonistic relations of distribution within capitalist society had curtailed the expansion of domestic markets, compelling the European countries to embark upon imperialist expansion in order to realize the value of their industrial output. Parallel with Europe's dependence upon foreign markets had come a growing reliance upon external sources of supply for food and organic raw materials. An abundant supply of cheap labor had discouraged the mechanization of rural production, resulting in a, quote, agricultural thrombosis, end quote. Europe had become over-industrialized relative to Europe's agricultural base. In the years following World War I, America had accentuated Europe's difficulties by invading Europe's former overseas markets. The only long-run solution to this dilemma was to link European industry with the agricultural potential of Russia. In the meantime, Europe would stagnate. The world economy had been dismembered by the war and the Russian Revolution, and, until such a time as the workers seized political power in Europe, Preobrazhensky believed that Soviet economic intercourse with the capitalist encirclement would be of little quantitative significance. Given the economic isolation of the Soviet Union from 1921 onward, Preobrazhensky concentrated his attention on the problem of, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, or forced saving within the country for the purpose of financing reconstruction. During the years 1921 to 1926, Preobrazhensky published numerous pamphlets and articles on this subject, each of which carried the argument to a higher degree of sophistication, culminating in the New Economics. Yet behind each refinement of the theory of, quote, primitive accumulation, there lurked what Alexander Ehrlich termed the, quote, Preobrazhensky dilemma. Or an awareness that sufficient capital for industrialization might not be generated within the country without entailing the possibility of renewed civil war. Footnote: see Alexander Ehrlich's article Preobrazhensky and the Economics of Soviet Industrialization in Quarterly Journal of Economics, published in 1950. See also Alexander Ehrlich's book, The Soviet Industrialization Debate. End footnote. Where am I? Ehrlich's reference to the, quote, Preobrazhensky dilemma appears to suggest that in the final analysis, Preobrazhensky found himself trapped in a logical contradiction. Quote, primitive socialist accumulation appears to be a desperate gamble based upon idle speculation concerning the eventual possibility of assistance from a proletarian revolution in the West. But Preobrazhensky was too consistent a thinker to build his policy recommendations on the basis of such a fundamental contradiction. Preobrazhensky not only hoped for a proletarian revolution in Europe, Preobrazhensky was convinced of the proletarian revolution in Europe's historical inevitability. Preobrazhensky's arguments in favor of, quote, primitive socialist accumulation cannot be properly interpreted without reference to this underlying conviction, which is most cogently summarized in the book From the NEP to Socialism. Isn't this idea kind of true of Trotsky and like the rest of the Bolsheviks as well? Particularly Trotsky. Particularly, it seems like to me, from what I understand of Trotsky's entire life work is kind of like this almost eternal optimism about the necessity of proletarian revolution, including like a very optimistic idea about how soon Stalinism would collapse. But what do I know? In 1922, Preobrazhensky expressed confidence that Soviet Russia would succeed in financing gradual improvements in the economy for up to a decade, after which time the country would enter a period of crisis. The additional capital required for a major technological transformation of peasant agriculture would not be available. The crisis in Europe would mature, however, at approximately the same time, bringing, with the crisis in Europe, a great economic crash and proletarian revolution. Proletarian Europe would then redress the balance between its own industry and agriculture by investing in the Soviet Union. The answer to the, quote, Preobrazhensky dilemma, in other words, would be the international revolution. 5 years later, Preobrazhensky's views had not changed. In 1927, on the eve of Stalin's, quote, left course, Preobrazhensky wrote that the domestic contradictions of the Soviet economy demonstrated, quote, how strongly our development towards socialism is confronted with the necessity of breaking out of our socialist isolation, and of leaning in the future on the material resources of other socialist countries, end quote. Preobrazhensky did not believe that socialism could be built with Russian resources alone. Like Zinoviev, however, Preobrazhensky thought that political obstacles would prevent any significant restoration of economic ties with Europe until the workers had taken power. This belief created the potential for disagreement with Trotsky and ultimately led to the split. Trotsky was not prepared to wait for a political change in the West. Trotsky argued that the historical unity and interdependence of the world economy were based on more objective factors than politics. During the war communism period, Trotsky had been reluctant to restore contact with Europe until Russia's own recovery was underway, fearing that unfavorable terms would be dictated and the Bolsheviks would be forced to acknowledge the Tsarist debts in exchange for, quote, a pound of tea and a tin of condensed milk, end quote. Trotsky. When the Geneva Conference convened in 1922, these fears were put to the test. The prospect of economic assistance was held forth to the Soviet government in exchange for significant concessions pertaining to the issues of nationalized property and the Tsarist debts. Although many members of the Communist Party had entertained exaggerated hopes that a compromise might be found with European creditors, the conference ended in failure to reach agreement. As the hope for direct assistance temporarily abated, however, Trotsky became increasingly convinced of the possibility of surmounting Russia's isolation through the renewal of grain and raw material exports. By 1925 to 1927, Trotsky had developed a comprehensive strategy for industrialization based upon corresponding imports of industrial equipment and manufactured consumer goods. This approach to industrialization resulted from Trotsky's unique concern with the international division of labor. Whereas Preobrazhensky explained Europe's need for exports in terms of inadequate domestic demand, Trotsky went beyond this contradiction and focused on the significance of modern technology. The advance of industry had brought with the advance of industry accelerated technological progress and a dramatic rise in the, quote, organic composition of capital, end quote, or rising capital intensity, with the consequence that production could only be profitable on a steadily growing scale in service of international markets. The War of 1914 to 1918 had therefore resulted from commercial rivalries caused by the contradiction between contemporary technology and the limited market potential of the nation state. It represented, quote, an insurrection of the productive forces, that is, of human technology, against the foolishness of man, who brought nature under control, but could not control the spontaneity of society, end quote. Sorry, I feel like I fucked that up. It represented, quote, an insurrection of the productive forces, that is, of human technology, against the foolishness of man, who brought nature under control, but could not control the spontaneity of society, end quote. Trotsky. Or, as Trotsky commented elsewhere, quote, "The basis of internationalism is not an empty principle, but the lack of correspondence between new technology and nation-state markets. From this lack of correspondence arise imperialist wars on the one hand and proletarian internationalism on the other." End quote. Trotsky. Internationalism for Trotsky was not a political principle, but the subjective reflection of the objective course of economic history. Just as Tsarist Russia had begun industrialization by drawing upon the capital resources of France, so Trotsky believed Soviet Russia would embark upon socialist construction by availing Soviet Russia's self of the opportunity to import commodities and capital from abroad. Footnote, see Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution and Results and Prospects, pages 181 to 182. End footnote. The inordinate fixed capital costs of modern industry would preclude any effort to achieve economic self-sufficiency. To rely solely upon domestic savings would entail the inevitability of civil war with the peasantry. The world division of labor, as an objective historical product, could not in any case be substantially altered by mere, quote, superstructural phenomena and differences in ideology. Soviet industrialization would presuppose broad participation in the international economy in the years preceding the socialist revolution in Europe, as well as after. As Trotsky wrote in 1927, quote, "A properly regulated growth of exports and imports with the capitalist countries prepares the elements of the future commodity and product exchange, bracket, which will prevail, end bracket, when the European proletariat assumes power and controls production," end quote. The building of socialism was an uninterrupted process. The building of socialism could not be divided into distinct stages, separated by a, quote, abyss, end quote. Trotsky's interpretation of historical dialectics was more ambitious than Preobrazhensky's. Preobrazhensky saw industry and peasant agriculture as, quote, a unity of opposites, end quote, wherein the worker state would use, quote, unequal exchange, end quote, to appropriate the economic surplus produced in capitalist agriculture, in the same way as merchant capital had transformed the social surplus of feudal society into industrial capital. Trotsky used the same analogy, but in a broader sense, applying the analogy to international as well as domestic relationships. By the mid-1920s, Trotsky had concluded that the economies of Europe had resumed the appropriation of, quote, surplus value, but were unable to undertake corresponding investments for want of new markets. Soviet Russia should therefore provide the required markets in exchange for imports of Europe's redundant capital. The dialectics of history would result in socialism being nourished at the breast of capitalism, just as capitalism had been nourished at the breast of feudalism. Footnote, see Trotsky, Towards Socialism or Capitalism. And footnote. Capitalist Europe and Socialist Russia were a unity of opposites, and capitalist Europe and Socialist Russia's unity dictated the necessity of capitalist Europe and Socialist Russia's interaction. New section, Specific Problems. From this preliminary summary of each man's position, it will be apparent that the logical structure of Trotsky's approach to industrialization was significantly different from Preobrazhensky's. The difference was readily apparent by 1925, although its origins can be traced back as far as 1921 and the introduction of the new economic policy, NEP. Four specific problems seem to have been of central importance in this connection. 1. Soviet Russia's policy with respect to foreign concessions. 2. Soviet prospects for direct foreign loans. 3. Import policy with respect to capital equipment. And 4. Import policy with respect to manufactured consumer goods. If we now consider each of these problem areas in more detail, it will be possible to document precisely the strains that grew up within the opposition and the general theoretical considerations involved. New section, Concessions Policy. In 1921 to 1922, Trotsky and Preobrazhensky both reacted negatively to ambitious proposals for an external NEP in the form of an aggressive concessions policy. Trotsky worried over the conditions that foreign capitalists would impose in exchange for renewing foreign capitalists' pre-war operations in Russia. Moreover, Trotsky believed that Europe's recovery was still too problematic to permit large-scale capital exports. Footnote: see Trotsky's article, Report on the New Soviet Economic Policy and the Perspectives of World Revolution, published in The First 5 Years of the Communist International. End footnote. By 1925, however, Trotsky had revised his opinion. Europe was now regaining its capacity to export capital at the precise moment when the Soviet economy required large new investments in order to continue growth beyond the pre-war levels. There now seemed to be a legitimate basis for a mutually advantageous relationship. Thus, in July 1925, Trotsky warned against being overly cautious in concessions policy and denounced, quote, "We are now more inclined than a few years ago to pay foreign capitalists significant sums for ... foreign capitalist participation in the development of our productive forces," end quote. Trotsky. The question of concessions, Trotsky explained, will become increasingly important as the Soviet government undertook to expand the Soviet government's industrial plant, for domestic savings were, quote, "not large enough to carry through to the end the renewal and expansion of our factories by our own resources," end quote. Trotsky. Pravda, July 29, 1925. Preobrazhensky's attitude toward concessions was much more rigid. In his book, Finances During the Epoch of Proletarian Dictatorship, published in 1921, Preobrazhensky stressed that the need for, quote, "socialist accumulation" arose from the fact that Soviet Russia did not enjoy any meaningful prospect of outside support. Not only were concessions unlikely, concessions were also dangerous. In the autumn of 1921, Preobrazhensky wrote an article on the perspectives of the NEP and argued that foreign concessionaires, should foreign concessionaires return to Russia, would become the natural candidates to lead a counter-revolution. Sorry, I lost my spot. In the book Questions of Financial Policy, also published late in 1921, Preobrazhensky noted that the foreign trade monopoly might generate revenues with which to moderate the budget deficit. Quote, "As for concession capital," end quote, Preobrazhensky continued, quote, ... "we cannot expect serious revenues from this source, ... end quote. Preobrazhensky. In February 1924, the Journal of the Communist Academy published Preobrazhensky's article entitled "The Basic Law of Socialist Accumulation." The article, "The Basic Law of Socialist Accumulation," later reappeared in 1926 as the second chapter of the New Economics. Here, too, Preobrazhensky maintained that concession capital was a threat to weaker Soviet enterprises, and that, quote, "too large a dose of concession capital taken into the organism of the state economy may begin to disintegrate it, just as in its time capitalism disintegrated the weaker natural economy," end quote. Preobrazhensky. While Trotsky by this time was speaking out against excessive caution in this area, Preobrazhensky asserted that, quote, "caution in the field of concessions policy is an ... economic necessity ... end quote. Preobrazhensky, 1924. The final version of the New Economics appeared in 1926. Preobrazhensky summarized his viewpoint with the comment that, quote, "a cautious attitude towards concessions is connected by the closest internal link with my entire set of ideas," end quote. Preobrazhensky, 1926. New section, Foreign Loans. On the question of Soviet Russia's prospects for long-term foreign loans, the identical pattern is evident. As in the case of concessions, During the early NEP period, Trotsky was suspicious of the plans of Sokolnikov, parenthesis, the finance commissar, in parenthesis, and others to reach an accommodation with the West. On one occasion, Trotsky protested that before foreign assistance was given, Russia would be obliged to surrender the oil deposits of the Caucasus, disband the Red Army, and expel the Communist International. Wait, was that... I'm not sure who that quote is. I'm going to repeat that, see if it makes sense again. As in the case of concessions, during the early NEP period, Trotsky was suspicious of the plans of Sokolnikov, parenthesis, the finance commissar, in parenthesis, and others to reach an accommodation with the West. On one occasion, he, I'm not sure who he is it Sokolnikov or Trotsky? I don't know. On one occasion, he protested that before foreign assistance was given, Russia would be obliged to surrender oil deposits of the Caucasus, disband the Red Army, and expel the Communist International. By the autumn of 1922, these fears had been alleviated by a good harvest, which relieved the immediate pressure on the Soviet government, opened up the prospect for some degree of, quote, socialist accumulation, and, as Trotsky said, made it possible to, quote, await a change of humor on the part of foreign capitalists without becoming unduly nervous, end quote. Trotsky, 1925. Concessions and loans would now affect the tempo of Russia's recovery. Concessions and loans would not determine Russia's recovery's outcome. This was Trotsky's position until 1924, when the question of foreign loans again became topical in consequence of the negotiations between the Soviet Union and Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government. By 1925, for reasons already mentioned in connection with concessions policy, Trotsky concluded that the time had come to pursue long-term credits in earnest. At this point, Trotsky once more found himself at odds with the less flexible views of Preobrazhensky. Preobrazhensky at no point denied the usefulness of a foreign loan. Preobrazhensky simply considered it unlikely to materialize. On that basis, Preobrazhensky refused to countenance the formation of domestic policy to suit the whims of foreign capitalists. Preobrazhensky saw the finance commissariat's endeavor to restore the gold standard, and with it, foreign, quote, confidence in Russia, as a senseless diversion of resources from industry. During the early years of the NEP, Preobrazhensky explored the possibility of a, quote, commodity loan, whereby Russia would borrow finished manufactured goods and repay through grain exports, with no money changing hands, but Preobrazhensky eventually abandoned the project as impracticable. In August 1923, Preobrazhensky returned to Preobrazhensky's customary theme that domestic saving must be accelerated at the expense of consumption, because it was, quote, hardly likely that Russia would receive significant long-term credits in the near future. In the New Economics, he treated the question of a loan with the analytical detachment of a skeptic. Foreign capital, Preobrazhensky argued, quote, does not desire to flow on a large scale into an economic system of a type alien to itself, end quote. Preobrazhensky. It followed that, quote, new resources must be gathered within the country, end quote. Preobrazhensky. As Trotsky became more hopeful that Russia might find a workable relationship with the capitalist countries, Preobrazhensky commented that the capitalists were becoming more antagonistic toward the Soviet Union. Underlying this despairing attitude was Preobrazhensky's persistent fear that a loan might thwart industrialization rather than promote industrialization, that the availability of foreign manufactured goods on credit might be used to rationalize lethargy in socialist construction. New section. Capital equipment imports. Trotsky was no less concerned with the tempo of industrialization than Preobrazhensky, but Trotsky approached this problem from a different standpoint. In Trotsky's judgment, the rate of expansion would be determined not merely by the rate of accumulation, but also by the investment strategy decided upon. Repeatedly after 1925, Trotsky pointed to the long gestation period caused by the capital intensity of modern industry. Large-scale construction projects, especially in heavy industry, would tie up scarce capital for a period of 3 to 5 years before new production became available. In the meantime, light industry would suffer. The, quote, goods famine would grow more acute, and relations with the peasantry would deteriorate. The import capacity generated by capital imports and grain sales should therefore be used to purchase inexpensive capital equipment from foreign producers who serviced the world market and thereby enjoyed significant economies of scale. The capital costs of industrial self-sufficiency, in Trotsky's view, were primitive. At best, Trotsky estimated, the Soviet Union in coming years might be able to produce 1/2 of the Soviet Union's own industrial equipment. Soviet industry should therefore specialize in the simpler types of equipment that were in greatest demand, maximizing the scale economies available within the country and importing the more complex items from abroad. In this way, economic bottlenecks would be avoided, the danger of inflation would be minimized, and the world division of labor would be harnessed in the service of socialism. Industrialization would necessarily involve a growing, quote, dependence of socialist Russia on the capitalist encirclement. On the question of importing industrial machinery, Preobrazhensky's views were more compatible with Trotsky's than in the case of loans and concessions. A footnote to the second edition of the New Economics by Preobrazhensky appears to have reflected Trotsky's influence, for Preobrazhensky noted that even, quote, unprofitable exports might be highly advantageous to the state economy, quote, if the foreign exchange so obtained be used for importing machinery for industry which it is more expensive to manufacture here than abroad, end quote. Preobrazhensky, The New Economics. Comparative costs were not to be the sole criterion for determining import policy. However, Preobrazhensky took care to point out that in some cases, the state would have to purchase more expensive domestic products in the interest of long-run industrial growth. In the article, Economic Equilibrium in the System of the USSR, an article published in 1927, Preobrazhensky seems to have moved still further in Trotsky's direction. Now Preobrazhensky drew specific attention to the possibility of eliminating domestic bottlenecks through imports of foreign equipment. Quote, the precondition of our system's equilibrium, end quote, Preobrazhensky suggested, quote, is a maximal link with the world economy, ... end quote, Preobrazhensky. The fact that European heavy industry was suffering a, quote, permanent crisis due to excess capacity and over-industrialization appeared to confirm the possibility that Russia might draw more extensively upon foreign sources of supply. Yet even the question of machinery imports seems to have raised an important difference of principle. The thrust of Trotsky's arguments in the years 1925 to 1927 was to avoid an excessive concentration on heavy industry and to ensure a more diversified approach that would guarantee incentives to the peasantry. Without cheap consumer goods, the peasants would not market the peasants' grain, and the country's import capacity would be severely restricted. Preobrazhensky did not share Trotsky's conviction as to the immediacy of this problem. In an appendix to The New Economics, Preobrazhensky gave an arithmetic model indicating that the pattern of, quote, unequal exchange with the countryside could only be seriously modified after a preliminary concentration of investment resources in the capital goods sector. Elsewhere in the same book, Preobrazhensky spoke of priority investments in heavy industry in a way that later became typical of Stalinist orthodoxy. Quote, as we know, Preobrazhensky wrote, quote, ... the development of the productive forces of capitalist society and the development of technique lead, as a general rule, to an increase in the organic composition of capital, which ... means an ever-increasing importance of production of means of production. The possibility of extending the production of consumer goods and cheapening them is achieved by a relatively still greater extension of production of means of production, ... End quote. Whereas the question of capital intensity led Trotsky to conclude that the Soviet Union must permanently become a major participant in the world division of labor, Preobrazhensky saw machinery imports as a major temporary expedient. In this respect, Preobrazhensky's views were, as Deutscher suggested, more readily reconcilable than Trotsky's with the theory of socialism in one country. New section, Consumer Goods Imports. The consequence of this differing emphasis with respect to the peasantry became evident in connection with the problem of consumer goods imports. During the early New Economic Policy, Trotsky and Preobrazhensky jointly opposed large-scale imports of this kind on the grounds that such large-scale imports of this kind would undermine the recovery of domestic industry as a result of their cheapness and quality. Both men called for a policy of industrial protectionism to be enforced by the state monopoly of foreign trade. Once Soviet light industry returned to a condition of nearly full employment, however, Trotsky's concerns shifted somewhat from rigorous protection. Light industry, Trotsky argued, would henceforth have to become more capable of protecting itself by producing an inexpensive, high-quality product. Trotsky certainly did not intend to weaken the trade monopoly. Rather, Trotsky hoped to employ the trade monopoly in such a way as to meet the requirements of both industry and the consumer. To this end, Trotsky suggested that a policy of more or less permanent, quote, commodity intervention, end quote, would be required, whereby controlled imports of foreign goods would be used both to stimulate improvements in Soviet enterprises and to satisfy more fully the immediate needs of the workers and peasants. References can also be cited to show that Preobrazhensky approved, quote, commodity intervention, end quote, as a crisis measure, but only as a crisis measure, not as a program of lasting significance. Where the hell am I? Sorry, I lost my spot. Okay. In December 1925, Preobrazhensky explicitly rejected commodity imports as a long-term policy to deal with the, quote, goods famine. 3 months later, Preobrazhensky cautioned that permanent imports of consumer goods might lead to, quote, liquidation of the foreign trade monopoly, liquidation of socialist protectionism, the inclusion of the USSR in the system of the world division of labor on the basis of the law of value, and preservation of Europe's existing level of industrialization by way of the increasing relative agrarianization of our country, end quote. Preobrazhensky. New section. The law of value and the world division of labor. Preobrazhensky's reference to the law of value brings us to the underlying theoretical problem, which accounts for the differences we have been considering. For Marx, the law of value governed both pricing and the allocation of productive forces. In capitalist society, the selling price of commodities was said to be regulated by competition, so that every successful capitalist tended to recover both his costs of production and an average norm of profit. A capitalist who earned less than the average profit rate would invest his capital elsewhere. Should any capitalist earn a surplus profit, that capitalist's success would provoke new competition. In the international economy, the same forces would operate, spurring capital movements across the frontiers of nation-states, from areas of declining profit opportunities to those where greater gains might be made. The law of value, in this sense, was the, quote, regulator of a capitalist economy responsible for determining which capitalists and which countries would survive in the competitive struggle. To Trotsky's mind, there was no doubt that despite the revolution, the world law of value would continue to exert a regulating influence upon the transitional economy of the Soviet Union. This belief had two critical implications. First, this belief provided the logical basis for Trotsky's conviction that capital would in fact move from stagnating economies of Europe into Russia, so long as the Soviet government was prepared to pay foreign capitalists an above-average profit norm. And secondly, it suggested that Soviet domestic prices could not significantly depart from world levels without undermining the trade monopoly. Thus, while Preobrazhensky expounded the advantages of, quote, unequal exchange with the peasants for purposes of, quote, socialist accumulation, end quote, Trotsky was fearful that the terms of domestic trade would tend to become too unequal. In that event, the peasant would bypass the monopoly of foreign trade in one way or another. Contraband would grow, and all hope of building socialism would be lost. The impact of the law of value could be controlled by the monopoly. The law of value could not be negated. Consequently, Trotsky urged that Soviet pricing and investment decisions must be guided by continual reference to conditions prevailing in the world market. Quote, comparative coefficients, end quote, should be maintained to measure the competitiveness of Soviet commodities in both terms of price and quality. A poor coefficient was to signal the need for controlled imports on the one hand and for simultaneous investment on the other, designed to improve the coefficient and mitigate the pressure on the monopoly. Quote, we are not free to choose the rate of development, end quote, Trotsky claimed. Quote, as we live and grow under the pressure of the world market, end quote. Trotsky. Toward socialism. The comparative coefficients would not only permit contraband to be controlled, but the comparative coefficients would also enable planners to discern where the comparative advantage of Soviet industry lay and would serve as guides to the optimal pattern of specialization to be pursued within the world division of labor. In this way, Soviet labor productivity would be raised to world standards. And as Trotsky argued, quote, every social regime is measured by the productivity of labor, end quote. Trotsky, 1925. All of the differences between Trotsky and Preobrazhensky converged on this central question of the world law of value. According to Preobrazhensky, the world law of value no longer operated in the era of monopoly capitalism. It had been displaced by trusts, syndicates, and cartels. The rate of profit no longer tended to be equalized, for the various trustified branches of production had been transformed into, quote, closed worlds, into the feudal kingdom of particular capitalist organizations, end quote. The preeminence of American capital in the world economy meant that American value relationships now set the international pattern. And these relationships in turn were arbitrarily dictated by American trusts. The sole escape from the hegemony of American capital was socialism, which would turn the economy into a, quote, monolithic organism, end quote, or into an equally, quote, closed world, where investment and pricing decisions would no longer be regulated by external forces. Behind the protective barrier of the trade monopoly, Soviet trusts would earn surplus profit through, quote, unequal exchange, without fear of outside competition. Investment decisions would likewise not be regulated by the law of value, quote, the basis of the pricing of orders within the country, end quote, Preobrazhensky wrote, quote, is not the law of value of world economy, end quote. Preobrazhensky, The New Economics. At a time when Trotsky expected Soviet Russia to return to the international division of labor on the basis of the law of value, albeit in controlled form, Preobrazhensky insisted that the law of value, were the law of value given free rein, would eliminate 3/4 of Soviet industry. Europe was already over-industrialized, and from the standpoint of market rationality, there was no justification for the industrialization of the Soviet Union. On the contrary, the free operation of market forces would merely preserve Soviet Russia as an agrarian hinterland. How the law of value could have such an effect if the law of value no longer existed was a contradiction that appears to have escaped Preobrazhensky's notice. The principal point, however, was that by denying any regulating role to the law of value in the Soviet economy, Preobrazhensky had in effect denied the unity and interdependence of the world economy as a whole. In doing so, Preobrazhensky effectively denied any lasting significance to the international division of labor, which Trotsky considered to be the objective basis of proletarian internationalism. In other words, Preobrazhensky's system of thought did provide the basis for a reconciliation with economic nationalism, autarky, or socialism in one country, at least in such time as proletarian revolutions occurred in other countries. At least until such a time as proletarian revolutions occurred in other countries. Thus, in 1923, 2 years before Stalin proclaimed the doctrine of, quote, two camps, the camp of socialism and the camp of capitalism, Preobrazhensky was already writing of, quote, two systems of world economy, end quote. 1923. Preobrazhensky, 1923. Deutscher is quite right to point out that Preobrazhensky stressed, quote, socialist accumulation, much more than Trotsky, but this difference in stress was not the explanation of the break in 1928. Rather, the difference in stress was itself rooted in divergent interpretations of the law of value. Trotsky believed that the world law of value would set objective limits upon, quote, socialist accumulation, a matter that completely escaped Preobrazhensky's attention. As Trotsky wrote in May of 1926, quote, the interaction of the bracket domestic and bracket law of value and the law of socialist accumulation must be put in contact with the world economy. Then it will become clear that the law of value, within the confines of the new economic policy, is supplemented by a growing pressure from the external law of value, which emerges on the world market, end quote. Trotsky. In January 1927, Trotsky returned to the same theme, quote, we are part of the world economy, end quote. Trotsky explained to another member of the opposition, quote, and find ourselves in the capitalist encirclement. This means that the duel of quote, our, end quote, law of socialist accumulation with, quote, our, law of value, is embraced by the world law of value, which, seriously alters the relationship of forces between the two laws, end quote. Trotsky. New section. Conclusions. By 1927, it was obvious that Trotsky and Preobrazhensky had grown apart. The unity of the early NEP period had disintegrated over the question of economic nationalism or internationalism. All that remained was for Stalin to launch the attack on the peasant in the name of industrialization. In 1928, Stalin defended the, quote, left course by arguing that since the Soviet Union neither received foreign loans nor exploited colonies, there was no alternative but, quote, to industrialize the economy on the basis of internal accumulation, end quote. With respect to the peasantry, Stalin explained the situation as follows, quote, they overpay for bracket manufactured and bracket commodities, and they are underpaid in the prices they receive for agricultural production. This constitutes a supplementary tax on the peasantry in the interest of industrialization. It is something in the nature of a surplus tax, which we are obliged to collect in order to raise the level of our industry, end quote. Stalin. Only after, quote, several years, end quote, Stalin added, would it be possible to eliminate this supplementary tax levied in the form of what Preobrazhensky had termed, quote, unequal exchange. In light of these developments, Preobrazhensky must have experienced a deep sense of personal vindication. Stalin appeared to be following the prescriptions of the New Economics to the letter. Moreover, the predictions of Preobrazhensky's earlier book, From the New Economic Policy to Socialism, also appeared to be on the verge of fulfillment. The revolution had not yet come in Europe, But Preobrazhensky saw signs of an impending crisis in the United States, a crisis which was bound to destabilize the already fragile economies of countries such as Germany or the United Kingdom. Russia's crisis would therefore correspond with the coming crisis in the West, and the workers of Europe would at last come to the aid of their Soviet counterparts. In these circumstances, it is perfectly understandable that he should write to Trotsky in the spring of 1928 and propose that the opposition not merely support Stalin, but even go so far as to accept, quote, responsibility for the, quote, left course. Trotsky refused to accept any such responsibility for the reasons I have outlined. In his judgment, the project upon which Stalin had embarked was totally misconceived under the influence of a narrow provincial mentality. Had Preobrazhensky foreseen the full consequences of Stalinism, Preobrazhensky would have accepted responsibility less eagerly. It was not the international revolution that resolved the, quote, Preobrazhensky dilemma, but forced collectivization. And, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, and, quote, turned out to involve far more, quote, primitive methods than Preobrazhensky ever contemplated. Once Preobrazhensky rejoined the party, however, Preobrazhensky was promptly deprived of any further influence on policy. In 1937, Preobrazhensky was murdered by Stalin, one of the millions of victims of the Great Terror. To attribute the terror exclusively to, quote, primitive accumulation would be an obvious simplification, but there's equally no doubt that industrialization in the pattern of the 5-year plans entailed a ruthless suppression of consumption. As material incentives vanished, terror was invoked in their place. Thus, if the, quote, left course vindicated Preobrazhensky, the experience of the 1930s confirmed Trotsky's forebodings. Whether or not Trotsky's proposal might have avoided these excesses is now an academic question. How one answers it depends upon one's judgment of the extent to which Soviet Russia's isolation was self-imposed. In any event, the pattern of Soviet aloofness from the world economy endured long after Stalin's death, and only recently has it shown signs of change in the context of, quote, detente. In this regard, it is interesting to note how modern Soviet officials account for their country's renewed interest in both capital imports and foreign trade. In May 1973, N.N. Zemtsev, director of the Institute of World Economics and International Relations, wrote as follows, quote, in our age, in conditions of the rapidly developing scientific and technological revolution, changes in the instruments and means of production, in materials and in technological processes are taking place so quickly that no one country, however large and powerful that country may be, can develop the production of all types of output without exception, with equal success, and the same economic effect, end quote. N.N. Inozemtsev. E. Shersnev, deputy director of the Institute on the USA, argues that economic competition has now become the main form of struggle between capitalism and socialism. In these circumstances, he declares, both sides had an interest in, quote, using the advantages of the international division of labor, end quote. In 1973, N. Patalichev, Minister of Foreign Trade, explained that, quote, rapid technological progress cannot be accomplished without the extensive use of world achievements, i.e. without the active development of the international division of labor, end quote. It is amusing to speculate how Inozemtsev, Shersnev, and Patalichev might respond to the charge of, quote, Trotskyism. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.